Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fifth Mito Artisan Playtime session. We believe that creating and connecting with other artists creates healing. Whether you're young or old, a seasoned artist, or just curious, we're so glad that you've joined us today to explore art together. Just to give everyone a little history, our Mito Artisan Playtime space was born out of a conversation with artist and Mito champion Christine Knox. Christine is an illustrator with Mito who has led all of our sessions so far, and she has walked us through how to draw everything from zebras to eyes to holiday ornaments, and I know she will continue to share her drawing techniques with us in the future. One of the hopes that Christine had for this space when we started was that we would be able to draw other artists to lead these sessions of creativity for a deep collaborative experience. So it is with much excitement and anticipation that Joey Hernandez is joining us today to share about her journey as an artist with low vision and give us practical tips and tricks to continue art even when Mito affects our vision. Josephine, also known as Joey Hernandez, is an independent artist whose sight deteriorated over the course of a couple months. Her sight went from being relatively average to legally blind due to what could be later diagnosed as Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, also known as LHON. Joey's field of vision became permanently blurry, and she began to constantly see moving neon dots. Her lights are what sparked her initial interest in painting. Frustrated that she couldn't find images representing how she saw the world, Joey decided to pick up a paintbrush to try to show it herself with acrylics. Her first acrylic paintings were attempts at her own vision simulations. She quickly fell in love with the medium and has been painting ever since. Her work has since been featured in several shows, including the International APH Insights Art Competition. Joey uses a variety of adaptive strategies to create her work. She hopes to change the narrative about who can create and enjoy art. She writes about some of these adaptive strategies in her blog, Artisans Adaptions Corner, which we will post a link in the chat. And if you're viewing this after a live session, you should be able to see the link below the video. Joey is a proud alumna of California State University, Fullerton, and she aspires to someday teach other blind and visually impaired people how to travel independently as an orientation and mobility specialist. When she's not painting, Joey enjoys skateboarding with her white cane, playing with her cat, and telling terrible puns. And I hope that we get to hear some of those today. For those who are wondering, today's session is being recorded, so you'll have a chance to go back and review all that you've learned. There will be a Q&A at the end of today's presentation where you can either ask your questions in the chat and I can ask them for you, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. We love lively artist conversations, so we encourage and welcome your questions today at the end of today's presentation. Joey, we're so excited to have you here and so excited to learn from you and share and hear about your art and where you're headed with things. And so thank you so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Hi there, everybody. I am so excited to be speaking with you all today. As I was sharing with some folks earlier, I have been working on a variety of projects, so I'm definitely in the zone to talk about art and how wonderful it is. Quick bit of housekeeping. I am sharing my screen. Are you all able to, is that showing up on the other end?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So, to get started, um, I always like to start off with an agenda so you all know what to expect, what to anticipate for our presentations. This particular presentation is going to give a brief overview of the potential impact of visual impairment on art, discuss some options for using visual references. It's going to review considerations for lighting, positioning, and supplies, talk about non-visual strategies and organization systems, cover medium-specific considerations, highlight options for viewing art. So going beyond just creating art, if you want to go out into the community and find different options for enjoying art, then this will also have time for that. And of course, there'll be time for questions. Now I've got this PowerPoint up on the screen, but if you are unable to see it, or if you would rather listen to this like a podcast, no worries. All of the information conveyed will also be conveyed auditorily, so everybody will be able to enjoy it. Again, a little bit about me, so you know why I'm here today. I've been an acrylic painter for the past 10 years, graduated from Cal State Fullerton, and I'm currently at San Francisco State. I have placed multiple times at the International APH Insights Art Competition and have had my work shown elsewhere. And I am a board member for Orange County Arts and Disability, or OCA&D, a nonprofit focused on making the art world more inclusive, especially within the local art spaces for folks with disabilities. Couple of things to give you all a heads up about. The tips here are targeted towards folks with some functional vision. That doesn't mean that you need functional vision in order to create art. There are many artists who have no vision whatsoever, and it still is possible, but this just might not be the presentation with as many tips focused on that today. Every person is unique in their remaining functional vision, their accommodation needs, and their personal style preferences. So if whatever I share with you today, or if you happen to look me up at my artwork afterwards and you think, I don't know, this Joey person, her art doesn't really seem to go with what I'm interested in, that's okay. You can do whatever calls to you as far as art goes. And hopefully there will be tips that will be transferable and still applicable, even if you decide to go in a completely different direction. And another thing is I am not an eye professional. So I think the first thing for figuring out what accommodations work best for you in your art practices is understanding how your visual impairment affects what you see, because visual impairment is something that is very broad. There are so many different ways that it can affect how people see, even within the Mito community. So for example, my condition, LHON, I have many friends with LHON, and no two of us see exactly the same. So knowing what works for you is very important. There are many ways vision can be affected. Some people have reduced fields, which is the overall area you're able to see. Some people have reduced acuity, which is the level of clarity. Some have reduced color sensitivity. I know that's very common for some MitoArtisans with low vision. Some people have reduced contrast sensitivity. Some people have difficulty in dim or dark settings, or conversely, may have difficulty in particularly light settings. Depth perception can be an issue, and again, there are many more ways vision can be affected. So it's good to kind of take a moment and understand how your individual vision is affected. Here are some examples on the screen showing two different types of visual impairment simulations. One shows somebody with a very reduced visual field, and they can only see like a small section of a courtyard. The other one shows somebody with reduced acuity, where they are looking in a cluttered art room with many shelves, and they're not able to see any of the details there. The strategies that these two people would use might be different from one another because of these differences. If you want a better idea of my vision, again, everything I see is really blurry. This is a simulation showing what it looks like when I skateboard. And it is very blurry in the center with neon lights that are moving around and changing colors. Now, let's talk about some of the actual strategies and get past all these disclaimers. Visual references. When you might, or what are they and why you might want to use them? If you are creating artwork that is inspired by something that is existing in the real world, so if you're interested in creating something inspired by a real person, a real place, real objects, you may want to use a visual reference. You don't have to. You can also work off of your imagination and your memory, and that is perfectly fine. But it's perfectly okay to use visual references. Fully sighted people get constant unimpeded access to visual information. So they constantly have access to the visual world. And by using a visual reference, what you're doing is you're essentially bridging that access gap. And what do I mean by visual references? I do mean pictures. So often when I'm creating my artwork, I like to work off of pictures that I take that are located on my phone. Again, you don't have to do this, but it is an option out there. And also, Another thing I'd like to mention too is it doesn't mean doing one-for-one copying. It can mean that you're taking very strict inspiration, but it could also mean that you are fascinated by, like, let's say you came across an interesting garden and it had an interesting pot or plant there that had curves that were fascinating to you when you're going by. If you use a visual reference and you use your phone, then perhaps you can draw inspiration from the degree of those curves. But let's get into some more specifics on this and how they can be used. They can help the artist get a better idea of either the big picture or these, my goodness, I am clicking too fast, fine details. So, like I mentioned earlier, visual impairment can affect people in many ways. If you are somebody with reduced visual fields, it can be very helpful to get an idea of the big picture instead of just seeing one section of an area at a time. If you want to instead get the overall gist of what something looks like perhaps an overall scene, let's say you're in a busy room with a lot of people who are moving around, and you want to kind of get an idea of what that overall room looks like, what kind of the harmony between the different objects might be. Then what you can do is you can take a picture and then zoom out, hold the picture farther away, and get that into wherever your field of vision may be. Conversely, if you are somebody with reduced acuity, then what you can do is you could zoom in and get all the fine details of an image. So for myself, for example, I don't have enough remaining vision to see faces anymore, or at least I don't have enough vision to see faces from what would be an average viewing distance. Now, if I was up close and personal with somebody at the point where, you know, we can smell each other's breath and it's uncomfortable, then I can see their face, but I would rather not do that. So instead, I could take a picture of somebody's face and then zoom in super big so I can see the details that I need to see. As far as what device to use, if using a reference photo seems like that might fit into your artistic practice, ideally, you want to pick something that allows you to move around and manipulate the picture. So using a digital touchscreen device as opposed to, let's say, a printed out picture might give you a little bit more freedom. You have to consider your individual needs and priorities. So some examples of how that could factor into what would work best for you. You want to think, do you need to be hands-free? Do you need to look at a larger surface? In that case, a tablet or some other type of larger screen with a stand, that might be helpful. So again, let's say you're somebody who feels more comfortable when you have a larger surface area, tablet might be the choice. Let's say you perhaps have difficulty holding something for a long period of time and you have fatigue in your arms. Tablet on a surface, tablet with a stand might be more comfortable for you. If you are somebody who your particular artistic practice, like let's say you're somebody who loves doing things with wild colors and paint splatters everywhere, and you're like, I need both hands to toss paint at the my surface, then tablet might be a better option for you. However, if you are somebody who needs to bring your device closer to your face, then something smaller that can be handheld like a smartphone might be a more comfortable option. If you have the opportunity to test things out and see what is more comfortable for you, perhaps let's say you have a friend with a tablet or you already have a smartphone, it might be good to experiment and see what works best, because again, every artist is going to be individual. Now let's talk about positioning and lighting. Actually, before getting into that, something I would encourage everybody to do is if any of that rung true for you about the reference photos. So let's say you're somebody who likes to draw inspiration from real life. I'm going to give you all a moment to look through your photos on your phone or device or whatever you may have with you, or to think, what would be something that could be fun to doodle later? You don't have to commit to a major drawing. You don't have to commit to a larger project. Just think of something that you would enjoy, um, working on just for fun. And I'm going to do the same thing on my phone. And I think I am going to pick a picture of my nephew because my nephew is adorable and that's going to bring me joy. Give everybody that second. Okay, now we'll get into lighting. If you still need to look through your phone for something, that's okay too. So positioning, this can make a huge impact on how you're able to use your remaining vision. Again, some artists might not want to use their vision. So even if you have vision, you may decide, I want to do everything non-visually. That is okay too. However, if you do want to use your remaining vision in your practice, something that can help you is thinking about how far away you are from the area that you want to look at. So if you are a painter, if you are a pencil artist, a charcoal artist, if you use pastels, you may want to think about that surface area that you're focusing on. So notice that I didn't say canvas or paper, and I specifically said the area that you want to look at. The reason why I said that is because distance makes a huge difference. What you're able to see at 3 inches away from your face might be vastly different from what you're able to see at 10 inches away from your face. And that could even be on the same paper. A solution that can help for some artists is to use easels. These allow you to prop your pieces up closer to your face, and some are adjustable. The adjustability can be very helpful for some artists. So, for example, you can look at different sections of a painting. If you have, let's say, a very large canvas or a very large piece of paper, you can move an adjustable easel around so that way you can look at that area that you're focusing on. I have a very well illustrated, pardon me, I am not a graphic design, I am not a digital artist, but stick figure demonstration of why it can be helpful to have a easel. The stick figure on the left is sad and is looking at a flat canvas on a table, and there is a much longer line between that stick figure's eyes and where they are looking at on the canvas, meaning that they might not be able to use very much of their vision there. Whereas the stick figure on the right has an easel that is propped up, and the canvas is much closer to that stick figure's face, and that one is smiling because it is easier for them to use their vision. Again, thinking about the overall area that you want to look at, I have another demonstration of a stick figure at a canvas on a easel. There are 3 sections of this large canvas. One section is too high and might be a little too far away and too hard for that artist to see unless they adjust the easel. One section is just right and is very close to eye level, and one section is very low. Kind of makes me think of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, you know, is it too high? Is it too low? Is it too, finding that perfect medium is good. Another thing that can be helpful is thinking about the surface size. So this can be helpful for some low vision artists, picking out a larger canvas or a larger piece of paper. With this, a particular barrier. So if you're somebody who is needs to be seated, if you are a wheelchair user, something to note with surface sizes is that there is such thing as too big. Sometimes certain larger canvases may require somebody to stand up in order to comfortably be able to view it. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about what size you want to use. Another thing to consider is lighting. Lighting needs are different for every person, so you might want to start thinking about what types or shades of light might work for you. So, for example, me and fluorescent lights don't get along. Um, so if I was in an area and I had the choice between using a fluorescent light or a different type of light, I would go for the different type of light. You might want to think about the amount of light, the direction of the light. Is it helpful for you to have overhead lighting, spot lighting, over the shoulder lighting? You want to think about where are their shadows being cast. So I know my big head gets in the way a lot of the times, and then I have this huge shadow that makes it harder to see certain sections of my pieces. So um, it's helpful to experiment if you have the chance. I know what works best for my individual vision is to use a mixture of overhead lighting plus over the shoulder lighting. Um, and I found that that's what works best for me. If you have the chance, I encourage you to get a low vision assessment. These can help you learn more about lighting and positioning, and some nonprofits offer free low vision services. So, for example, in Southern California, Braille Institute has occupational therapists who provide low vision services. Um, so, uh, this might not be an option, but if it is an option, I encourage you to check out the nonprofits that are in your area, see what services they provide, and let them know early on in the appointment, hey, art is something that's important to me, and I want to figure out how to maximize my vision to create art. Some additional positioning considerations. If you have muscle fatigue or pain, which some MitoArtisans may have, is you may need to factor in time for breaks during your art sessions. Sitting in certain positions for long periods of time can be difficult for some artists, so you don't have to do that. If it is helpful for you to take breaks, step away, maybe set timers so you don't have experience pain from being in one seated position for too long, that is perfectly okay. Another thing that can be helpful is researching what style of chair is most comfortable for you. Some chairs may provide additional support and may work better for some people. So, for example, I have a friend who has severe nerve damage, and for him, being in harder plastic chairs can be difficult, especially for extended periods of time. So he prefers to use chairs that have a backing to them, that have a cushion available, and that's what works best for his individual needs. Another thing too is if you experience fatigue in your arms, it might be helpful to have a surface to prop up your arm if you are painting or drawing. So something that you can just stick your elbow on and keep that up there, so that way you don't have to physically lift up your arm for longer periods of time. Again, this is a process. Figuring out what works best for you is very individual. So again, every artist is going to be different no matter what. And it may take some experimenting and trial and error. Now we'll talk about some non-visual strategies and organization systems. Trays, tarps, and poster boards. These are amazing. Trays can help with keeping items together. So if you have multiple tools and you are afraid of them rolling around and you losing what's what, especially if you have low vision, it can be hard to find things. Trays are great. I often get my trays from dollar stores, and I'm able to find little plastic ones with the lips there, and that's been helpful for me. So it's not something that breaks the bank. If you have a hard time finding a tray, or let's say maybe you don't have as many financial resources available to you, paper plates can also be good if you have smaller tools that you're working with. Tarps can be helpful for protecting the floor or table or whatever you're working on from any spillage if you're working with a messier medium. Um, and poster boards are a low-cost alternative to tarps. So if you don't want to spend the money on that, I am a poster board gal. That works for me. And an added bonus is that you can make your setup more high contrast. So for many different visual impairments, the amount of difference between shades of what's in the forefront versus what's in the you know, background can make a huge difference in how well you're able to use your remaining vision. So things that are similar shades can be harder to see, and things that are more have higher contrast and have more difference can be easier to see. So I have some examples on the screen. I've got some words that are written in low contrast. The colors are very similar. And for me personally, it's very difficult to read on the left. Whereas on the right, it's higher contrast and much easier to read. So with a poster board, you might imagine, let's say you have a bunch of tools that are dark or colorful. You might want to use a white poster board. So that way it's easier to find your tools if you set them down on the floor or on the table. Whereas if you have a lot of tools that are light colored, then you might want to use a dark colored poster board. Here's again an example of the principle of contrast. It is a cat sitting in two rooms. One room is very light and it's very easy to see the black cat sitting there. The other room is very dark and the black cat kind of blends in. And this makes me think of my cat because my cat is black and I lose her all the time. So organization systems. Labeling can be so helpful when you have low vision. Large print labels in particular can be a great option for some of your tools. You can use masking tape and a permanent marker to write down what different objects are. This can be especially helpful for pencils, markers, and other handheld mediums. So for my pencils, I don't do pencil drawings as often as I used to, but I do use them from time to time. And so what I do is I take my masking tape, I wrap it around my pencil, and then I leave a little bit of extra tape over the side that I tape to itself. So it kind of forms a small flag. And then I write on my pencil with permanent marker, and I write if it is a 2B, if it's a 4B, if it's, an HB, which again lets you know how dark or how soft the pencil is. And you can use that same principle again for other mediums. You might not be able to write out the full color, but you might want to create a system for yourself. So for example, if you're somebody who wants to use colored pencils, and maybe let's say you have some reduced color sensitivity, instead of writing out violet or the full color name, you might want to create a shorthand and maybe put V. So that way, when you grab the pencil, you read the large print label, you see that it says V, you're grabbing your violet pencil. Tactile stickers and bump dots can also be helpful. You can use different shapes and textures to denote different materials and colors. I use these on my paint tube so that way I can easily tell everything apart. I could always magnify with my phone, but that is a little bit tedious, and it's much easier for me to instead just go off of the shapes of everything. Rubber bands are another option. So again, for my paint tubes, I use a rubber band on my favorite color, which is dioxazine purple. And it makes it very easy to tell which tube is the correct tube I'm looking for. For organization systems, if you are a painter, palettes can be helpful. So something you can do is when you're squeezing out your paint, you can count the wells. So for example, let's say you have a harder time seeing colors. You might know, okay, I'm squeezing out my ultramarine first. And then right next to that, I'm squeezing out my viridian. And then right next to that, I'm going to squeeze out my cadmium red. So then, if you find the ultramarine, if you feel and go 2 wells to the right, then that's where your red is. For some people, it can be helpful to add tape or something else onto the palette to denote that you have like one section that's like your reference section. Another thing that can be helpful is if you have some color vision and if you're able to see one color better than the others. So for example, a lot of people with LHON have a much easier time seeing blue than any other color, then you may want to think of where everything is in reference to where the blue is squeezed out. For organization systems, shelves, drawers, and boxes can be also be helpful. Having a specific space for specific supplies can help you figure out what you're grabbing and when. Also using containers that are perhaps labeled or in the same spot every single time can help you more easily find the supplies that you're looking for. When you're setting up your organization systems, you may want to use a couple different tools to initially get everything ready. So using a magnifier, whether it be handheld or electronic, an image description app, or friends and family members. For magnification, if you don't have a magnifier, but if you have a smartphone, you have an option available to you. For iPhones, for example, if you were to say, hey Siri, open magnifier, then there's already one embedded into your iOS devices. If you have an Android, an option that you can use is the camera app and take a picture and zoom in on things in order to read labels, for example, if you're setting up your large print labels. For image description apps, I always like to recommend the free ones because life is expensive enough as it is. Why not go for free options when you can? Seeing AI is a great one that's available on Android and iOS. Google Lookout is another option for Android, and Be My Eyes is again available on Android and iOS. With Be My Eyes, you can connect to a live volunteer and use your camera on your phone. So let's say you go to the art store, you get a bunch of supplies, and you go home and you want to label your supplies. You can connect to a volunteer, point your phone at your supply and say, hey, what does the label on this say? And then you create your own label after reading out the official one. Some other things to consider are your non-visual other sensory skills, your tactile and proprioceptive skills. Some mediums are inherently tactile, so ceramics, sculpture, some forms of printmaking. With that, you might not even need to use your vision as much as you're expecting because you may use your hands quite a bit in this. You may use your fingers, your sense of touch quite a bit. If you are using something that requires handheld tools like brushes, palette knives, and other tools, you can learn to remember where you placed those. So for example, you might think, okay, my smaller brush, I set this down and it was closer to me. And my wider brush, I set this down a little bit further away from me. So I know if I'm going for my wider brush, I may want to extend my arm a little bit further. You can also use things like the shape, length, and thickness of handles in order to more easily identify your tools. Again, it might be an option to bring your tools up closer to your face so you can see what's what, but if you had to do that every single time, it gets tedious and it can impede your art process. So if you have the option to identify it non-visually, then that is great. For some artists, you might be able to identify the feel and sound of your paint if you are a painter. And you may start to learn little bits of sensory input that are medium specific. So for example, if you are painting and you feel quite a bit of drag, then that can let you know, okay, maybe I'm running out of paint. If the brush is gliding smoothly, that lets you know, okay, maybe I still have a decent amount of paint on there. If you are able to feel the weight of your palette, that this can tell you how much product you've used. If your palette feels significantly lighter, then you might know, okay, I'm kind of running low on supplies. If your brush makes a sound, that can sometimes give you input. So for example, if the sound is quite scratchy, that lets you know, okay, maybe there's not as much paint on my brush as I thought that there was. Or it could let you know that the brush that you're using has particularly stiff bristles. Um, Again, with practice, you're able to start to notice these smaller, finer details more and more over time. You're not going to immediately notice this right away, but you could start to pick up on things like that. These examples are mostly related to paint, but if you take up a different art medium, then you may notice other smaller intricacies and start to work off those. If you have additional sensory disabilities, which can happen to some Mito artisans, here are some other things to think about. You would want to focus on the techniques that work best for your individual needs. So I gave a bunch of techniques there, but if you are somebody, for example, who has hearing loss, then you might not, decide to pay as much attention to the sound of your brush as somebody else, and that's perfectly fine. Um, if you have low vision and neuropathy, for example, it might be better to instead focus on large print labels and tactile labels. So even though some Mito artisans may prefer to use the stickers and the bump dots and all of that, if you have a harder time feeling things with your fingertips, then stick with the large print labels and use the remaining vision you have. That's perfectly fine. Again, this is a very individualized process, and you're going to want to pick out the things that work best for you. Um, Now, here are some additional tips and considerations. Again, like I've said before, experimentation is probably the most important thing. Trying things out, figuring out what you like, what you dislike, that will help you on your overall process to getting to where you want to be someday with art. Um, if you are somebody who does painting, your hand placement you is something to consider because you are more likely to touch the painting during the process. Again, many people have difficulty with depth perception, and I know sometimes I do, so I end up being closer to my thing or my surface than I expect in my moments away from painting, and then I accidentally touch my canvas all the time. That's okay. Just be aware that that's a possibility, and know how that'll affect the type of paint that you use, if you are a painter. So for example, I use acrylic paint that dries quickly. Usually there's no problem, but if you're an oil painter, it might take longer to dry and you may end up smudging your painting. And have hand sanitizer, paper towels, and a trash can nearby. And actually, I would say that for almost every Mito artisan with low vision, hand sanitizer and a trash can and paper towels are just good things to have on hand. Um, some medium specific considerations. The techniques that you use will depend on what mediums you use. So what works best for a sculptor may not work as well for a painter. And even for painters, what works best for an acrylic painter might not work as well for a watercolor painter. Um, You also want to consider safety. How does proximity to your material affect you? So if you're somebody who needs to get closer to something, like let's say you have reduced acuity and you need to get to that position that's 2 to 3 inches away or whatever distance, it can be helpful to do a little bit of research beforehand and see, okay, is it safe to inhale the air this close to my medium? Um, if you are working on an easel, you'll have to consider gravity because that will start to pull down the materials that you're working with. Know the viscosity of your material. So if you are a painter, again, for example, if you are using thicker paint, those tends to stay in place and you won't have any issues. If you're using a watery or thinner paint, this can get pulled down. If you are using a thinner paint, you might want to alter the amount of water that you're using in a single brush stroke. Um, if you are using a dry medium like charcoal or pencil, then this won't really affect you. Um, it's not like the pencil's going to drip down and dribble down. So you should be okay then if you are using an easel. Um, those are most of my tips as far as creating art. I'm going to get into a couple more specific tips after this. But the next section is going to be about enjoying art. I love going to museums. I love going to galleries. I love going and checking out other people's artwork and gathering inspiration from that. And there are some ways to make this a little bit more accessible. Um, oh, the first thing I'd like to mention is museums. I would encourage you to research what types of accessibility options the museum you're interested in visiting may have. So some museums have large print maps, information panels, and image descriptions. Some museums offer touch and audio tours, and this information is usually available online on the museum's website under an accessibility section. So for example, the Contemporary Art Museum of St. Louis has some tactile paintings that people are able to check out, feel, and get a one-to-one representation of some of the artwork there. They don't have that for every art piece available, but that is there. San Francisco, a Museum of Modern Art, they have large print maps. So if you're trying to navigate around the museum, they have that option available to you. If you are going to the Broad, they have the panels that describe the artwork. They have a binder that you can borrow that's all large print descriptions of the artwork, which when I had the chance to go to the Broad was so fun to be able to read and hear about the history of everything and gather inspiration that way. Um, an additional thing that some museums may have is they may have free or reduced fare if you have a personal care assistant coming with you. So if you are a Mito artisan who has a family member who might need a family member, friend, or a specific personal care assistant to help you out when you're out in public, that is an option that you have in some places. If you're going to smaller galleries or other art venues, you may want to bring a magnification device such as a phone or tablet or a digital magnifier or a monocular. I encourage everybody, if you can, if you're interested in going to local galleries, to go on opening events and special events. Because sometimes you can meet the artists and ask them about their work. I find that it is much more interesting to do that than to squint at a piece from a distance, when you can actually hear from the creator. If you have a trusted friend, you might want to go with them and ask them to give you some audio description of what is there for the pieces. Um, Smaller galleries often let you get closer to the artwork. And if you are in a gallery with quite a few people there, it might be easier for you to be able to use your remaining vision to look at the artwork that does not have crowds surrounding it. So if a bunch of people tend to be right around one particular piece, sure, that piece might be interesting, but they might be a barrier to you being able to use your vision to see it. So instead, maybe go for something that's a little less popular. Those are my tips for enjoying artwork out in public. I have a few other things I want to go over, but before I do that, I want to stop and check in on questions. I want to know, what would you all like to learn? What are some concerns or questions or things that might have popped up throughout this presentation? We are running a bit early on time, so there is plenty of time for questions.
If you want to maybe temporarily unshare your screen and then we can see people, but it's easier for me to see if people have questions. You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions, or there have been some questions that have come up in the chat. One that we can start with that we were talking about is Rachel mentioned that she has, in regards to, she has neuropathy and dexterity issues. And so she was curious about if you have neuropathy and dexterity issues, that larger handle sizes might help. And you can make your handles larger. Oh, wait, no, that I'm reading what I wrote to her. My goodness. She was asking what kind of accommodations when you have neuropathy or hand issues. Rachel, you might want to add, I'm trying to go up. She said, okay, curious about art options for those with hand pain dexterity issues. I've done finger painting, but I'm looking for additional ideas for hobbies that might accommodate hand pain with her neuropathy. So do you have any ideas for that? What I had suggested, I'll just tell you what I had put in the chat in response. What I had suggested is that if you can get different size handles for your painting tools, or if you wrap items, like you could wrap gauze around it, or the stuff that they do with blood draws that that they wrap around your arm, that's a little bit more tactile. So then, you could wrap that to make it thicker so you have different sizes so your hands aren't always staying the same size like while you're trying to paint. Or if you tape you could tape things like sponges to your fingers, so you're still using your fingers, but you're having like different textures. But you're a painter, so you probably have lots of other tips and tricks and stuff for those that are struggling with dexterity and neuropathy issues.
Well, I would definitely echo what you've said. I have known some artists who have used the larger handles and that has worked for them. I have heard some people, I don't think it was for art supplies, I think it was for a different supply, but somebody has used the wrapping that they use on tennis rackets. And that was helpful for a different type of tool. So I'm wondering if that might work for handheld art tools. Another thing is there are some people out there who will 3D print and create holding devices. So for example, there was one that I came across that had, it was like a glove that you would put on your hand that had a strap that goes along the backside, and then it would hold a pencil or a crayon or whatever thing that you wanted to hold, and you could just move your entire palm. It might be good to see if there are any 3D printer artists or I forgot or adaptive tool creators out there to see if you can perhaps work with one of them to come up with something that would work better for you. And for that too, it might also be good to experiment with different mediums to see what is most comfortable for you. So for example, something that's smaller, like charcoal pencils, pastels, they can be doable with some of these adaptations, but perhaps you might discover that that's just not what's as comfortable for you, and you may discover that there's a different medium altogether that might be a little bit easier. For painting, something that you might want to try out that I actually like quite a bit is tempera paint sticks. These are very thick sticks that might be a little bit easier to grasp with tempera paint, and they instead of having to like dip your paint into or dip your brush into wet paint, the stick itself is the paint. And it has a plastic coat outer coating, so your hand will be clean. And it blends pretty easily. It's fun to work with. So that's something you might want to look into. They're about, I would say, like an inch thick. So if you're able to grasp that a little bit easier, then that might be something worth trying out.
I love the adaptive tool that you were talking about, that you could tape it to your hand and use your whole hand to make it with a 3D printer. That's a really great idea. Do other people in the space have other ideas or things that they've used? I see, Christine, you put in here an idea in regards to trimmers.
Yeah, so one of the things that I use, because I have a lot of hand pain and a tremor, is I use there's a couple of different kinds of splints or gloves that I can get from the Arthritis Society, and they have lots of adaptive tools as well for that. They've got these rubber or silicone things that slide onto pencils and pens to make them easier to grip. And they actually have an indent to them as well so that you can hold them differently. And there's different shapes, so you can find the shape that's right for your need, because we all hold pencils differently. And so there's one that you can actually grip your whole hand around, and so it doesn't necessarily create as much strain on individual fingers. I'm trying to think some of the other things that I saw. And the nice thing too, at least at my Arthritis Society, they have a clinic and I can go and actually try all the different implements to see what works best for my hands. and what can accommodate my tremor better. And there's different tools that are weighted to help with tremors. And so there's lots of options you can check into that way. And if you go online, there's a place that you can go for you. I think it was, I put in the search bar artists adaptable tools or something of that nature, and that brought up some other options I had not considered.
I love that. I mean, I hadn't even considered the idea of weighted tools, but that makes so much sense. So it sounds
Mm-hmm.
like that, you know, that there's a lot of different things out there. I think sometimes when things change, whether it's our vision or whether it's like our dexterity, as artists, it can be discouraging. And then I think it's helpful to talk with other artists to lead to the encouragement of, okay, like you can adapt, right? That's what we do as artists all the time, as we're having to adapt and we're having to change, and we're having to create. So it's another form of art just to be able to create the method of doing new art. When my son was young, one of the first things I learned about his condition is that he's very susceptible to going blind. And so that changed the way that I uh, I'm a potter, so it changed the way I did my pottery. I myself am not blind, but thinking about what would it be like for him to touch the pots that I'm making, it changed the way that I did texture or how I decided to do it. And so um I think it's a good conversation for us to have with each other as artists, but also to be continuing to have with ourselves as we're having to adapt and change the way that we're doing things. Which brings me to a question that I had for you, Joey. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that when you lose with as an artist with low vision, you kind of have to decide, do you use your remaining vision or not? And so I'm curious if you can share a little bit about your process of deciding about that, like as to whether or not to use your remaining vision or not as you pursued your space as an artist. Oh, wait, you're muted.
All right, for my practice, I've decided that I prefer to use my remaining vision when possible. And for that, that's just personal preference, and that's really what it comes down to. But I know some artists, for example, who will, they will use their remaining vision, but they use it quite loosely. And what I mean by that is they don't focus on putting things in their closer to them so they can maximize what they're able to see. I know some people who are like, I want to barely be able to see my canvas and work off of the very loose shapes and things that I'm able to see from there, because that's part of the fun and the process for them. So if you are somebody who is very attached to your remaining vision, or perhaps you really like working on finer details, then you may decide that using your remaining vision is a better option for you, or maybe it might be the better option just for particular pieces that you're working on. But if you're somebody who is not as attached to perfection and is not as attached to the idea that this has to look exactly like whatever thing I'm trying to make this look like, then you may find a lot of fun in letting loose a little bit. And earlier I shared that using your vision is not a necessity for creating artwork. There are many artists out there who are totally blind who create work. One of the examples that I like to use is John Bramblett. And so what he does, I can't speak in depth as to, everything that he does, but some of the things that he'll do is he will create raised line paintings using like almost like a puffy paint, and create outlines of his artwork. And then for his paints himself, he will use different textures. So he'll know, like, for example, my black paint might have a slicker texture, and I might add sand and have a coarser texture to my red paint. So that way he's able to tell what's what, without having to use his vision at all. So again, it comes down heavily to personal preference. Another thing you may want to consider is visual fatigue. So something that is very common for people with low vision is you may experience difficulty and discomfort if you're using your vision for extended periods of time, or if you're using your vision when you're especially tired, stressed, or hungry. So if you perhaps, let's say you're having a day where you're looking to unwind, maybe you spent the whole day filling out forms or working on some strenuous, visually taxing tasks, and you are looking for something fun to do. In that case, you might not necessarily want to use your vision for creating artwork, and you may want to go for some of the more non-visual strategies in order to de-stress and, make it as fun as possible. It all comes down to personal choice. What works for you one day might not be the choice you'd want to take another day, and that's perfectly fine.
So you talked a little bit about lighting differences and and how you can use that in order to enhance like your work. And I'm curious if there are particular lamps or that you've found to be helpful or that other artists to use. And I also wanted to I have a particular lamp that I found helpful. It's right in the back here if people can see it, but I wanted to share my screen because I pulled it up just in case it would be helpful to anyone at all. Let's see if I can share. So this particular lamp, it has a lot of arms attached to it with like 5 different light bulbs. And so for me, I have a really hard time seeing when lights are dimmer. And so if I can bring this closer to my work, I can put it behind me and and the arms are movable, which is really nice because then I can move the light in exactly where I need it while I'm working. And so when I'm carving and stuff, I can see better because I have like spotlights on it, but then I also can decide if I want all the lights on or if I want, some of the lights on. So that's my favorite lamp, and it's a Target buy. Not that I'm promoting Target per se, but it is found at Target for like the last, I don't know, like 15, 20 years. I feel like these things have been around, but I really appreciated that.
That is so funny because that's the exact lamp I use.
Oh, is it?
I use that plus an overhead light. And I have like 3 heads of that lamp pointed towards my artwork over my shoulder. That's basically the exact one I use. Again, I would recommend experimenting and trying things out if you have the chance, or if you are able to go get a low vision assessment, doing that, because lighting needs are so particular. Again, even amongst my friends within the LHON community, I know that my lighting needs are different from other folks, because I have some friends who, when it is too bright in a room, or like the indoor lighting is too much, it gives them migraines. And so for what works for me might not work for them, because I tend to be like, all of the light, give me all of the light possible, whereas that for them would not be good.
You mentioned this assessment. Can you just talk a little bit about what it takes to get the assessment and where people can go in case they're not familiar with it?
Yeah, so these would be done well, you can get them done in a couple different places. I'm recommending nonprofits because, again, I prefer to recommend options that are low to no cost. And so some nonprofits are able to have a specialist meet with you, talk about, okay, how are you using your remaining vision? What visual tasks do you need to do at home? How are you doing those currently? What tools do you have at your disposal right now? And then they'll talk with you about, like, okay, let me actually watch you, for example, open a sample piece of mail, see how close you're getting to it, see if there's any adjustments or recommendations that I can make in order to make this a little bit easier. And they'll look at a variety of different functional tasks that you do. Usually they have like some sample reading materials or sample things for you to look at. And they can either give you recommendations on how to modify what you already do, or some tools that might work better for you. And like, as far as lighting goes, oftentimes they will have multiple types of lighting available within their office. So I know, for example, some spaces, they will have like a light that they'll shine over you when you're like looking at a particular visual object, and will ask you like, okay, is this more comfortable or is this more comfortable? And then they can recommend like an exact amount of lumens, which, determines how bright something is, that works best for your vision. And then from there, they could say, okay, when you're researching, different lighting options afterwards, here's what could work for you. Here's what you might want to look up. Here's what could be a little bit more comfortable. And they can help with the things like outside of art too. So for example, if you are having trouble reading the mail at home, if you are having trouble watching TV, if you are having trouble sewing, whatever visual tasks that you need to do, you can talk with them and they'll see if they can work with you to figure out some strategies to maximize your remaining vision. For me, again, the example that I'm using is a nonprofit based out of Southern California called Braille Institute. Again, for their process, if you're somebody who wanted to get a low vision exam with them, the way that it works is that you would need first to be registered with Braille Institute. So they need a doctor referral form. It's basically a one-page form that just says, yep, this person has a visual impairment. You don't have to be totally blind to get their services, or you don't even have to be legally blind to get their services. You just have to have low vision at bare minimum, and have a doctor say, yep, you got low vision. And then from there, you're put on they put you on a waiting list. They try to schedule an appointment with you for like the intake and see, just in general, what services you need. You let them know, hey, I have low vision and I'd like a low vision assessment. Then they would say, okay, great. They schedule you for your low vision assessment, and then you would meet with somebody in person for that. For Braille Institute, again, for example, there are multiple regional centers all throughout Southern California. So there are centers in Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, Coachella Valley, Riverside, Laguna Hills, Anaheim, San Diego. So you would find whichever one is closest to wherever you live. And that's just the process for one particular organization. There are other organizations throughout the United States and abroad. I am not as familiar with their particular processes, so it may look a little different. They may have a different timeline or a different set of things that you need to do in order to get to that low vision assessments. But it can be helpful to just research what resources are available in your area, and there might be something equivalent there. You might also be able to get a low vision assessment with your insurance. Again, it's different for everybody. I would research what you have available to you, and that's what that would look like.
Yeah, and I think it's good to remember too, whether, the Braille Institute, even if you're not in Southern California, if you called them, a lot of times these places can help you get to the right space in other ways because they're all connected. So try not to be discouraged too if you find a space that maybe isn't in your area, there might be something that they may be able to help you get accessibility with that. And I also just want to mention that Josie mentioned in the chat that she uses a neck lamp to help with lighting stuff. And sometimes I also use a headlamp, like a camping headlamp, sometimes because then you can get in closer as well when it comes to lighting. Matt, you asked a great question, and I also want to say if you want to unmute yourself too, you can feel free to ask it. But Matt said sometimes I get frustrated. I might use my pencil too hard so I can see the lines. But when you use the pencil harder and it's darker lines, that makes it harder to then erase on paper, right? So he's using darker lines so he can see it, but then if he needs to erase it, then it's really hard to erase lines. Do you have tips or tricks with that?
I do. So, you may want to switch out your pencil. You may want to switch out your eraser. So for pencils, it might instead of using more pressure, it can be helpful to use a darker pencil. So for pencils, you have what's called different hardness and softness levels. The softer the pencil, the darker it is. HB is what you would get for like your middle regular pencil. If it is an H pencil, then that means it is lighter than regular. So if you have difficulty seeing low contrast things, don't want to use H pencils because then it'll be harder to see. The higher the number, the lighter it'll be. Um, Conversely, if you have a B pencil, then it'll be darker. So the higher the number, the darker it'll be. So if you have a hard time seeing an HB, then maybe you want to try a B. And then if you have a hard time with that, then maybe try a 2B, 3B, 4B until you find something that's a little bit more comfortable. Another thing that you might want to do to make things a little higher contrast is to get a wider pencil. So for myself, when I use pencils, I tend to use mechanical pencils. I've got some tips on those in a second, but if you are somebody who uses a wooden pencil, then you might want to use a little bit of a duller pencil, because if you have a duller pencil, then the line will be a little bit wider. Or you can even get like wooden pencils that are just thicker in general. But if you're using a mechanical pencil, in addition to the number for hardness and softness levels that you'd want to look at, you'd also want to look at the size of the pencil. So common sizes of pencils, 7 is like your middle of the road mechanical pencil. Your 5s, they're going to be really small. And it'll be harder to see a 5 than it is to see a 7. 9 is really nice if you have low vision. That's going to be your wider pencil. So if you're using mechanical pencil, I would recommend trying out a 9. And for the hardness and softness levels, you can get different lead refills for mechanical pencils in different hardness and softness levels. I tend to use Pentel myself, and Pentel, it'll let you know what you're purchasing. So for example, if I wanted to get something that was wide and if I wanted to get something that was dark, then maybe I might get a lead 9 to 4B. So that's really dark and wide, and then that would be easier to see. So that might be a little bit easier to erase than pushing harder onto the paper.
Wait, can you pause real quick? So
Yeah.
so what you're saying is that if you get some of these like higher, like these darker materials, that it's still easier to erase because you're not pushing as hard, so you don't have the marks. Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. Sorry, keep going. I just wanted to clarify.
Oh, no, great question. Yes. And then you also won't have the indent in your paper from pushing as hard. The other thing I would recommend is trying out different types of erasers. Not all erasers are made the same way. Some erasers work a little bit better than others. So I would say experiment and figure out what works best for you. Personally, what I have found that is most comfortable for me and that erases really well, I also tend to use Pentel. I use their high polymer eraser. It's a little white eraser, and it kicks butt. It is great. It gets things so much easier than the little pink erasers that are kind of standard. So that might be worth trying out.
Do you feel like the high polymer eraser is better than like the kneaded eraser? Do you have opinions about that, or you or Christine?
Personally, I feel that it's better in some regards, but it depends on what you're trying to do. So with the kneaded eraser, that can be helpful if you're trying to get certain small areas and trying to like detail erase. But I think for as far as getting things erased, like that eraser altogether, the high polymer is more comfortable. Another thing that you might want to consider is if your goal is to get specific small areas, and that's what you're hoping to accomplish with a kneaded eraser, you may also want to try with an eraser pencil, because they have some pencils that are like mechanical pencils, but instead of having the lead in the middle, it has eraser in the middle. So that way you can erase detail work there, and it gives you another option. That can also be good for some people who have dexterity issues, because the kneaded eraser may be a more difficult tool to use, whereas you might be able to add the grip options onto a mechanical eraser or eraser pencil in order to more easily grasp it. Another thing, going back to the dexterity issues that some people mentioned earlier, is when it comes to erasers, there are many different sizes of erasers. So you may want to get a larger eraser that might be easier to grasp if that's something that you're thinking about as well. And then again, for the mechanical erasers, that might be something that you would prefer over a kneaded eraser, where you can add in the additional grip options.
Christine had a couple ideas. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so the mechanical eraser that I use is called a Tombow, Tombow. I misspelled it in the chat. So, and then the kneadable erasers are great because, especially if you have dexterity issues, you can form it to your hands and make it as pointy or as wide as you need it to be. I've used carpenter pencils when my hands are sore, and they can be easier to hold and make a bigger line, so you're not having to, be as sort of specific. And then there's larger pencils designed for children that they're just much larger. There's crayons that are for children. So there's quite a few options there. And another trick I use is this lighting system that I have. It's made by Ottlite, Ottlite, and it's got a sizable magnifier that even within the magnifier, it has a really much higher level of magnification. And it also has a built-in lighting system that can give you warm or cool spectrum lighting. So it's adaptable to whatever your needs might be visually. And also depending, and then there's the different levels of lumens as well that it can offer you. So it's really quite versatile for people.
Those are great tips.
Matt had a question in the chat in regards to, he said that it's hard for him to differentiate colors because he's visually impaired, specifically like the reds from the browns and black and violet and dark blue. And so you talked a little bit in your presentation about how to do that with paints and a little bit about tagging certain things with tape. But do you have other methods that we could consider as to how to differentiate when you have like specific colors and then I'm curious too, like how do you set your trays up like when you're getting ready to paint? So because it sounds like there's a lot of like if you do a lot of pre-planning, then you don't have to get interrupted when you're in the midst of like your creative mojo. And so that pre-planning is super important. Can you kind of walk us through maybe some other ideas and how you set your trays up and stuff?
Sure. So I think that the biggest thing again is the labeling. I think that that is the most helpful option that you have. And I would say it's helpful to label your supplies when they're new. And the reason is if you are using a magnification option or if you're using a t image description app like Seeing AI, it can be harder if you have a supply that's been gently used because it might be there might be like spots of paint or other, types of material on the thing that may make it harder for it to read out loud. So if you're able to label right away, that's what I would recommend doing. Another thing that I recommend is have a special label or secondary or some type of label for your favorite colors. So for example, if you have everything labeled, and then let's say you really want to use purple. I have a friend, for example, who one of the people that he really enjoys, her favorite color is purple. And so she wanted to make her a gift and he wanted to have a ton of purple everything. And even though purple wasn't his favorite color, didn't matter to him seeing it as well. That was something that he wanted to reach for frequently. That's when it might be helpful to do something like adding a rubber band or adding some type of secondary label in order to make that thing that you want to stand out even more visible. Um,
Do you have
But
ideas of other secondary labels? Like you mentioned a rubber band, you mentioned the tape. Are there other ideas of secondary labels that you've used?
let's see. Um, I, hmm. In a pinch, something that I have used when I was traveling and I didn't have my normal labeling materials with me, I've used hair ties. Um, I've even used scrunchies as like secondary labels. Um, so that can work. Other things, um, you can use Velcro. Velcro can be an option. And Velcro, a nice thing about that is if you're somebody with neuropathy, it might be a little bit easier to feel the Velcro than it would be to feel any other type of label. Again, depending on the severity of the neuropathy. And another thing that you can do with that too is with the Velcro, you can use your fingernail and scratch it and see if you can hear a noise. And with that way, you can go off the noise instead of just the touch alone. So that is something that is another option out there. Um, when it comes to the pre-planning, so every time I paint, I always work off of a new palette. Well, not like a brand new palette, but like a clean palette. And I just think of whatever colors are most important for me for that particular painting session. And I will again, work off of whatever color is most visible to me, and have that as like my main reference point. So I have a much harder time distinguishing between my blues and my purples, for example. So instead of using one of those as my visual reference point, I might use like my bright like fire truck red, and that might be easier for me to use as my reference point. And then I would know, okay, 2 spaces to the left from my red is going to be my purple, and 2 spaces to the right from that is going to be my blue. I find it can also be helpful to place different colors or similar colors further apart from each other. So let's say you have 2 different blues and it's hard to distinguish between them. Maybe having them on like opposite sides of the palette. That can be a little bit easier so you don't accidentally mistake one for the other.
Something I do, Joey, that really helps me is I have small palettes that have maybe 6 spots in them, and I put all of my yellows in one palette of the various types. And then I only have to remember, well, that palette has however many things. And then I have my red palette, my blue palette, you know, all of that so that I'm only having to identify what's in that particular palette of color range. And then I can even just put like 3 in, and I know that, you know, the top one's going to be my dark indigo and the other one's going to be my ultramarine and things like that, so that I can keep track of the colors that I want. And it just makes it easier for me
That's a
when
great
I'm
point.
working.
Another thing that I would recommend is if you're first starting out, limit your color choices because
Mhm.
it can feel overwhelming to manage like a bajillion colors, especially if you have a hard time seeing color. Um, so I would say it can be helpful to have just a couple instead of having, you know, a ton. And then as you get more comfortable with your colors, expanding your choices. Um, Again, what you use will come down to personal preference. Personal choice for me, if I had to limit my color range, um, if I could only pick a couple different pigment options, then I would pick um, probably a cyan, magenta, maybe like a Naples yellow, titanium white, and a burnt umber, which is a brown. If I could only pick 5 colors, those would be the ones I'd pick. But again, it comes down to personal preference. Um, so if you had to narrow down your choices, you may have different colors that you would instead pick.
Another organizational thing that I have is on the side of my drawing table. I have this, it's a metal thing that has little foam foam. I'm trying to think how to describe it. So I work with pencils primarily. So there's little slots in the foam where I can put my pencils, and there's probably about at least 10 10 different lines and 6 deep type of thing. So I can divide up my colors and know that, you know, my first layer is going to be whites and then yellows and then, you know, on and on progressively in my color scheme. And that makes it easier for me to find them and keep them sorted. So I'm not like dealing with this whole big pile of pencils that I'm having to sort through every time I want to change a color. So that's very helpful.
From a potter perspective, I've seen potters. There are certain materials that sink to the bottom of your bucket that you're using, and so I've seen potters take corks from like wine bottles and attach them to those tools, so it'll bob in the water if they want to set it there. And I've also seen them, sometimes they put like a little bit of clay, like if they're working on the wheel, they might put a little bit of clay to their left and a little bit of clay to their right, and then on the right you'll stick your ribs. And so you know that you have your ribs stuck in this clay, and then to your right you might stick your needle, or to your left you might stick your needle tool, and then the sponge will float in the water typically. So you kind of have these mechanisms of where things are, and you kind of do that setup ahead of time. So I don't know if you mentioned you had another little section, Joey. I'm not sure if you wanted to share that
You
as we're
know, I think that maybe that could be an option for a different day, but
okay.
I feel like we cover quite a bit and I don't want to
Mhm.
overwhelm anybody right now.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay,
Um,
I have one last question then. I think that your blog is amazing, and we had a friend reach out and ask if there's any way to like listen to your blog, like, or how do they go about doing that? I was curious if you could explain that.
you know, at the moment, I don't have an audio version of it, but that gives me ideas, and now I'm inspired to see if I can make one for friends who would find that more accessible. If somebody wanted to, if somebody had a hard time seeing it, some options that they have, if they are on a computer, there are magnification options. So for Windows users, the built-in magnifier that comes with the computer is called Windows Magnifier, and you can access it by pressing the Windows key and the plus key until it's at a magnification level that you're comfortable with. For Mac users, there is a similar magnification option. I'm not as familiar with it, but that is out there. And if somebody has a screen reader, built into their device, so if they use JAWS and VDA voiceover, it should be accessible. If anybody notices any accessibility issues with that, please come to me and I will try to make it more screen reader friendly. And that is an option as well on smartphones. So somebody can use the assistive technology built into their phone in order to more easily access it that way. But having an audio version is a great idea. And now that you brought it to my attention, I'm gonna see what I can do about that.
I think that's great because there's definitely, I know there's the ability you could like, I'm sure, like attach like a button below it, and you could have your voice reading it, which would be amazing. Well, we really, really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, Joey, and sharing all of your tips. And you're an amazing artist, and we just are really, really grateful that you have pursued art and that you've come today and shared your thoughts and your tips and your expertise. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to continuing to follow your blogs and to look at your art whenever we can. So thanks so much.
Thank you. I hope that you have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.